Hello, everyone. Luis Salinas here, going over my final project presentation. I am going to do my final project, or I did my final project with a unit lesson that I've done in the past, and I've reworked it a few times. But I decided for this assignment that I would add a visual handout so that students can try to better understand one of the more difficult things in terms of outcomes for this lesson. So if I could just go over real quick, the unit summary of this is AP US History Period 9, which is our final period, and which oddly enough is what I'm about to cover here in the next couple weeks. So Period 9 focuses on 1980 and basically to 2001 or so. The emphasis is the Reagan administration and sort of the revival of the conservatism movement. It also covers the end of the Cold War, something that we talk about in previous units. So, overall, that's really the summary of the unit. Real quick regarding the course itself, for students, in order to be recommended to this course, or things that they should be, already accomplished, is either had some type of placement earlier in their high school career. AP US History is a course that is taken by juniors. So usually they're on the AP track by the time they get to me. They've already, had some type of accelerated course in most cases. Now, there are exceptions to those, but nonetheless, that is a very common thing. Other things to consider for this class is that counselors and teachers do forms of screenings on these students. Sometimes this is through a formal means or an informal means. For example, I tend to do an informal screening on my students for next year. I usually recommend them, especially my freshmen, if I see that they're good writers, if you have sort of the foundational skills and good work ethic, I would recommend them to take an AP course, and that usually is something that counselors approve of. Something students should be able to do, though, by the time they get to their junior year with an AP course is the ability to cite textual evidence, understand differences between primary and secondary sources, and they should be able to work with other people collaboratively. So that definitely means that sometimes they have to work in groups, and they also have to make sure that they are able to divide those responsibilities. And then finally, some things that also help is obviously be motivated, very organized, and willing to present to their peers. In terms of the standards or the organization or source here, this is something that is governed not by me but by college boards. So anybody who knows anything about AP anything is governed by college boards. So these are the ones that align with period 9, and you can sort of see that in how they label them. The outcome, though, for me in this unit plan is to tackle one of the more difficult things for students to do, and that is the ability to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument. They would do this with various documents in the form of a document based question, and that's really the focus of this lesson. More importantly, one of the things that they need to be able to do is analyze the documents themselves. And for our course, we break that into what we call a HIP analysis. So this is going to have students focus on historical context. They might look at the intended audience of the document, the purpose of the document, and probably one of the hardest ones, the point of view. In fact, the reason that I picked this unit is because I wanted to create a visual that was going to be able to help students tackle on the point of view, and really teach them to come, like a second, almost second nature to them. And so that's why I'm using this lesson. Here is the timeline. So it covers about 2 weeks. I really break down step by step what we do each way there. For example, I do utilize Google Meets. Even now that we're in person, I break them out in breakout rooms. They work together to tackle on some of the major things for the topic. So we build contextualization right from the beginning. We talk about the Cold War. So we look at continuity from our previous units and how that plays into the 1980s. We look at speeches or primary sources. So we do a whole bunch of different activities. Then they also complete a long essay question along with the DBQ, which is a document based question. Now, what's nice about long essay questions, what we call LEQs, and the document based question, which we call DBQs, is that for the most part, they really do correlate or align very well in terms of skill level. The only difference is the document based questions are accompanied by 7 documents. Long essay question has no documents, so this one does need to come from student content knowledge. Materials for this course, and I mean specifically for this unit, is definitely their Chromebooks. I have a Promethean board in my course, or I'm sorry, in my classroom, and we divide up the screen so students can annotate, they can um, revise writings. So this is a good tool to use. This is brand new to me, and it's really effective. We use various applications through our Google Store, whether they're apps or extensions or add ons. College Board website is a phenomenal site for me as a resource, and students also use this as a resource. Anytime that I may come short on the lesson, I access AP daily videos where they have experienced teachers that might go into detail on a particular topic. So that's very useful. Students can access those very easily through our learning management system, which is for us Google Classroom. Students also utilize Screencastify, and this is the ability to record themselves. I usually use that, especially for students that have a hard time trying to express themselves in writing. So they do tell me that in an oral fashion, and then we can sort of practice or begin to put that in pencil or in paper. I'm sorry. Also, obviously, students need writing utensils, and then for this specific unit lesson, they need the Google Slide presentation. Here I explain how my media our handout is going to how I applied the 3 principles of design with proximity, color, and topography. I'll show the document here in just a second, but I did make it to fit 4 pages. Typically, when I make a handout, I really try to like to keep it to 2. If we're basing sort of what we learned from this class, I for me it's simplistic. It's one handout, doesn't overwhelm the students. But in order for this one to be effective, I decided to make it into 4 pages because I think that it really did need the organization the way it did, as I explain here. How I utilize the images, how I use the color, and how I use font size, and all of that. Color, I did try to go very simplistic. In our previous last class, I know that our professor did go over the use of color, which I found very interesting. But I did decide not to go to venture too much with color, but there is some, and I think there's an emphasis on why I used it, and hopefully I justify that correctly. Topography, I mean, again, I'll show that in just a moment. But again, I use various text um, alignments. I use different font sizes to try to, emphasize certain, areas. I used various types of them, and hopefully, this sort of flows nicely with the actual presentation. Here is the Google slide presentation. Now, these particular slides have been brand new. There are some of these slides that I created actually a couple days ago, so I'm hoping that given what we've learned in the class, I've improved some of those. One thing that I definitely have started is the use of an overarching question that I want students to think about. So, using sort of like a visual here, a light bulb. So, this is kind of like here's what you should be thinking about, emphasizing that this is the overarching question. And the question that we're looking for this unit is what accounts for the foreign and domestic policy accomplishment and failures of modern presidents? Modern being a key word since we're in our most recent unit, and then also having the students understand that they need to break this down through a foreign lens and a domestic lens. So that is the way I went ahead and did that. So here we begin this unit with, a 1970s kind of look. This is what we considered a contextualization part or a continuity from our previous unit. So there's always like a flow into it. Of course, history doesn't just happen like in a certain order. I do have to try to contextualize each and every time we cover things. But again, I do try to break this up with some of the most pressing, things from the unit. So obviously, Roe v. Wade is a very important one. Civil rights movement, we did a really big unit on that a couple weeks ago. So all these play into it. I won't go through every single slide, but just one thing I want, for presentation's sake, to notice is that I try to make it to where they, see the president. Um, a model that they might have used in their campaign, and then break it down in two category fashion. Like, here's what they did, foreign policy and domestically, and what are some of those big things. Obviously, Nixon Vietnam War was a big deal. Detente with is a new way of dealing with communism, and then domestic things that he dealt with, and obviously Watergate being one of the most important ones for his presidency. Same applies here for Jimmy Carter. And then we, break it down to conservatism, the resurgence of it, sort of what, are the focuses and what drives that, concepts. Then we break down Reagan's administration, again, keeping the same thing, foreign and domestically. George W. Bush, same thing. I'm sorry, George H.W. Bush, same thing, abroad and at home. Focus on terrorism, the war on terror, political shifts, depending on, the electorate. So we do get into a little bit with politics, a little bit with economics. Bill Clinton, again, same format, and also same with George W. Bush. And that's really where that ends. There's a minor chapter in this unit about Obamacare, but really this is about where College Board will grab from. So these are the potential content that will be on the College Board exam. So that is the presentation overall. Now let me go ahead and go into my visual that I created. So this is considered the point of view, which is part of our HIP analysis, which allows students to try to understand and analyze and put the document its time and place, and then utilize that document to prove an argument, to give validity to an argument. So I describe this as a comprehensive guide to explaining documents on the AP exam. So there is sort of that extension for students, and this really applies not just for this class, but any analytical work that they might do. And this obviously would include language arts, and even in science class and any of that, where you're starting to see a big emphasis on the use of evidence. So point of view, POV, I call it hold it down, and I'll explain where that comes from, is really teaching kids how to create that automaticness of how they should consider, what they should think about as they're looking at a document. So for example, one thing that I always tell the kids is demographics is important. So things to consider about the particular author, so this would apply to a primary source, is who is this person, what type of occupation did they have, maybe they had some type of educational background that is important. Where are they on the social class, if we might know that, socioeconomic, their status, what's the politics or philosophy of this author, nationality, maybe their religious affiliation, their age, gender, and race. I always tell them, gender I usually use as a good example, because if the gender is a female and they're talking about women's rights movement, obviously that's going to be a factor. However, what I have found in the past is that students get obsessed with gender, and they try to create something out of gender when something maybe isn't there. So sometimes it doesn't really matter if they're a male, a man, or a woman. Whatever they're talking about is obviously relevant to that particular person, time, and place. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's, the validity is lacking because they're a female or male. Sometimes it does matter. I got a description here to sort of emphasize that. So if I say a woman is the author of a document, you should always consider gender as an option. All right, so that is a possibility. However, I do tell them gender is not always necessarily the best option, because people fall into that. Often there's other consideration like political philosophy, that might take precedence at times. And I always tell them never try to make gender, the point of view where it doesn't exist. So that's a good rule for them to consider. And then I use this visual, regarding there's more way in the skin of cat, really emphasize the idea that, everybody's going to find the point of view in a very different way. It just sort of depends. and how the student utilizes it. And I'll kind of talk about that in the pitfall section. So again, here I say some sources may offer 34 choices. And again, I break this down a side by side because I think these 2 points are very important as the starting points. And I think overall they're pretty visually appealing instead of me giving them an exhausted list or a slide of some sort. One of my favorite things to teach is the reliability factor. Here, I just use the point of view as a way to kind of explain that, but there's other things to consider, and this is part of the hip. So understanding the situation, so what's going on in the background. In other words, the context of whatever that topic might be. It could be the Cold War, it could be World War II, it could be any of those. Audience, I want them to start thinking like when they designed this speech or when they did this document, who was their intended audience? And then if they can also find purpose. Now, the nice thing is students really only need to do one of those things for each document to earn the point on the College Board exam. So this is why I sort of put this here. Even though we're focusing on the point of view, these are important as well. I give them here, 3 things to consider to ask yourself as you're reading the document or studying the graph or whatever it might be. I say, before reading, what do you expect this person to say? While you're reading it, is that person saying what you expected? Because maybe it's not. And this is sort of, having their minds or their brains work and put it in motion. And then after reading, does the person benefit from what was said? And then I break down here. I have a nice little image. The willpower. People naturally want to say good things or do good things to help them advance in life and gain something. I think this is true with most people or history of the world. People do things for their interests. People are selfish by nature. So I figure out what someone has to gain, and you'll be able to find the point of view. One of the coolest videos that I've seen. This is not something that I necessarily created, but it's something that really stood down to me. And this is a clip that is shown by another AP US history teacher. And it's this person who says, "All I know is my side of the story. I can't tell no other story." So um, this Donna individual basically was accused of driving a getaway car, and she was arrested. But then she's out on bail, and then Fox News here, local Fox News is here interviewing, and they're asking her like, "Hey, did you really do this?" And she claims that she is legally blind and that she doesn't know much, and so it kind of gives them a tone, and it also teaches them that people are going to say what's going to self-preserve them, and that's how they got to think about these documents, that when people are saying something, there's usually something to gain, which is sort of what it says here. So if you hear this document being read, what would it sound like? Is it hostile, friendly, neutral? Is there sarcasm? Sometimes the tone can make a difference in the document's image. So that's something that students do not always understand. And then I also break down sort of like in an exhausted list here of special cases. Eyewitnesses, they can be seen as more reliable because they have direct experience with the situation. There's whole different ones, a foreign observer, anonymous. I tell them to consider these different ones here. Audience considerations, obviously, things to consider is private letter to a friend, a diary, something that's been published, a public speech, an official government document. Usually, when it comes to like a proclamation or a law, I tell them point of view is not going to be found there. So don't waste your time. And instead, they need to focus more on these 3 items here. What is the situation, maybe? Who is the audience? Who is the purpose? Or what is the purpose? I did create a point of view pitfall, and I talk about, what point of view is not, because I think that's also important, right? So one of the things that I often see from students is that just by sort of describing what's happening, they think that that's point of view, and it's really not. Point of view really tries to look at it through their point of view and express that in their writing through analyzation. One common one always that I find from students is, well, it's bias. Okay, sure. Well, what isn't, right? We all have bias. So that's not enough to say, and they need to be able to explain the point of view, how it relates to what the topic might be. So if there's a biased view regarding the Cold War, how so does that play into connecting to the prompt or the question? And so I think this one here has helped or I'm hoping that will help a lot of students, because that's one that often I think students make a mistake on. And then, of course, she'd say that since she's a woman, try to give them examples of how to better address that, right? Press the charge. You got to pretend like you have to be very specific as to what you're saying. So maybe a better example might be something like, as a woman, she would be inclined to support equal pay because it would result in her making more money. I mean, I think most people can understand that. That makes sense. Again, what does a person have to gain? That is more what we're talking about when we're talking about point of view. Also, point of view is not a substitute for describing. Now, this is important because one of the points in the rubric for the College Board exam, specifically for DBQ, is that they have to describe the document. Some students believe that once they've described it, they try to double dip and think that they've also given the point of view, and that's just not the case. So I do emphasize that as well. Finally, I say don't assume that visuals are necessarily neutral. That's a hard concept. Some students struggle with that. But what has motivated the person to produce at work? A good example is actually the Boston Massacre, right, by Paul Revere, who makes the redraws the event, and that's an easy one to sort of view the point of view, because Paul Revere was, of course, in favor of independence and separating for Great Britain. So that would be a good example. Finally, I end this handout by just keeping it simple and dividing it up so that it applies to also my colleagues who will teach other courses, but in my case for AP US History, which we refer to APUSH. So here, students can actually specifically see how someone might do that. One of my favorites is, the Salem witch trials in teaching point of view. So this one reads: the testimony from a supposed witch should be taken with caution, as those accused of witchcraft often had to make a decision of confessing with hopes of being forgiven, or not confessing, which would likely lead individuals to not believe in them. So this is student. I mean, this is clearly seeing the point of view given the context of the Salem witch trials. And so there's other examples there as well. So I appreciate everybody's time and for listening. But overall, this is my final project. Again, I used a previous lesson that I've used before. I've tweaked it a few times. This class also has made me rethink and how I deliver my presentations. I always not only try to go for a balanced slide, consider the colors and all that, but also let it be aesthetically pleasing and not overwhelming. Could I improve on some of these? I think so. I think this is always going to be a work in progress, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. All right. Nonetheless, thank you everyone for listening, and hope everybody has a great day.